Welcome to Jews on Film. My name is Harry Adensasser. I've got a degree in film studies, and I am currently a Jew. And joining me, as always, is my co-host, Daniel Zana.
Hi, Harry. My name is Daniel Zana. I'm a video editor, documentary filmmaker. Today, we are discussing the film Pretty Woman with our guest, who is the writer, host, and creator of You Must Remember This, about the secret and/or forgotten history of Hollywood's first century. Her new season, Erotic 90s, is out now, and you can check out the second episode, which focuses on today's film, wherever you get podcasts. Karina Longworth, welcome to Jews on Film. It's truly an honor to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So we start out, our podcast kind of just asking a few sort of questions just to kind of get people clued in as to why we are discussing the film today. And so I wanted to ask you sort of what made you choose to discuss this film on today's podcast for Jews on Film?
I really like Pretty Woman. I think it's a really good movie, and I think it's really interesting. And I think there's a lot to say about it that doesn't often get said. And I also think talking about it as like a Jewish movie is really counterintuitive. And I'm not even sure it is one, but I mean, it was directed by a Jewish person. So there's that. And the villain, I guess, is coded as like an evil Jew. So
Oh yeah, we are going to jump in on a lot of that, and I had never seen this movie. I was very excited to have an excuse to watch it, and did really love it. But I did watch it with my wife, who looked at me and said, "So what are you going to talk about on Jews on Film?" And I jumped to Jason Alexander a little bit in his codedness. I didn't know that the director was Jewish at the time, so that's really interesting. But we have some stuff we'll come up with that I'm very much looking forward to debating. How Jewish we can actually claim this is by the end of the episode.
It is kind of an interesting film. I had never seen it either. I grew up in LA, and so sort of seeing the landmarks, I was in the Valley, but seeing Rodeo Drive and things like that, parts of Beverly Hills and Hollywood and stuff like that. It's nice to see old sites, especially from the 90s. So the film, just for context, the film came out in 1990, is directed by Gary Marshall, written by J.F. Lawton, and stars Julia Roberts and Jason Alexander as Philip Stucky, but as Richard Gere as Edward Lewis. Yeah, I mean, the film started out initially as a script called $3,000 by J.F. Lawton, and it was quite a bit darker, I understand, before it was sort of sanitized quite a bit and retooled.
It went through a few different incarnations, and Julia Roberts actually agreed to be in the movie when it was called 3000, and when the story of it was, I guess grittier. She was living sort of more of a desperate life as a streetwalker. And at the end of the film, instead of there being sort of this romantic promise that these two people are going to be together and she will have access to his wealth, he just kind of dumps her back where he found her.
Yeesh.
And so I think it was not as fun. And I do know that Julia Roberts, she was very sort of a serious young actress, and she did a bunch of research talking to actual Hollywood Boulevard streetwalkers to prepare for the original version. And so when they kind of did these rewrites and Disney agreed to make it, and Gary Marshall became the director and was kind of trying to make it more of a screwball romantic comedy, she was still trying to bring in the research she had gathered from talking to real streetwalkers.
At the time, in 1990, Richard Gere, 10 years earlier had played a gigolo in American Gigolo, which you covered on Erotic 80s. And Julia Roberts, I think at this time, she had done, Mystic Pizza. And then there was one other film, but she was still relatively unknown. Yeah.
She had been in Mystic Pizza and a movie called Satisfaction. And she had done Steel Magnolias, which I think came out while she was shooting Pretty Woman or she was cast in Pretty Woman before Steel Magnolias had come out, but she was nominated for an Oscar for Steel Magnolias.
Oh, nice. And there's pretty big age disparity. I think she was in her 20s and he's roughly 40-ish, right?
Yeah, I think she was 22 when she made the film, and he was 40.
Gotcha.
I'm really interested in the way we're talking about how this film was sanitized from what it originally was, because I think, reading up a little bit about the legacy of this film and the way that it's viewed, nowadays, I would say in 2023, and the way people look back on it, I think a lot of its morality, its messaging has become a little bit more complicated than it probably was at the time. I know the way that the movie ultimately comes down about her work, as a sex worker. And there's this big narrative thread that I think we're going to talk about in a Jewish context a little bit, and you'll see how, because it might not be so obvious, but about how he's trying to quote unquote save her, right, from this life as a sex worker, and kind of, bring her out of that. And that the way that they talk so critically about, I think, some of the practice that she did in the context of the movie is what's, I think, been mostly reevaluated by a lot of contemporary audiences and trying to make sense of where this movie aligns. And I think what we're describing in this earlier version, which I don't know how much exists from it, if there was a script or anything, or what we know about it, but it sounds like, oh, so I would be fascinated in learning more about that and what it depicted, because it sounds like it could have provided maybe a more nuanced or just more rounded approach to sex work, instead of just kind of hinting at it and then casting it aside as like, this is what we need to protect her from. This is what the movie is saying, Richard Gere needs to pull her out of. So I would be fascinated to see, where that movie was originally going to be, not just in its content, but also in its messaging versus what we got today.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it would have been more nuanced. I think it might have been even more demonizing of the profession.
Right. Because you can imagine a version that, like you're saying, demonizes it. And ultimately, I think, Daniel, we spoke about how there even was, like, I think Julia Roberts, her character was supposed to be the one who's the drug addict or has a drug problem. And they actually kind of push her as far away from that or not as possible. But there's that scene in the bathroom we'll talk about later where Edward kind of calls her out and says, get out of here. If you're taking drugs, I don't want that in my hotel. And she's like, no, I've been sober for years. Like, that is not a part of my life. And it's, that's one version that's clearly like the Disney, like, we can't even imply that she's on drugs. We have to make it clear that even if she was, she no longer is. But you can imagine another version where that might have featured heavily, and I think, like you said correctly, probably been demonized even more, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think what that scene is doing is, he has an assumption of what a hooker is. And for him, a hooker does drugs. But why would he have that idea that, like, if a prostitute is holding something behind her back, it's drugs? And why would it be more realistic to show, to depict a streetwalker as somebody who does drugs?
From what I read, I think they decided to give Laura San Giacomo's character Kit. It seems like they kind of gave her that sort of the trait of being the addict. Earlier in the movie, we kind of see that she has stolen some money and purchased drugs and things like that. So it seems like Vivian is sort of the example that sort of breaks the mold, sort of others in the film, and she's kind of different than the rest.
Just I'm interested, in our discussion now to kind of again weigh in and together the three of us on just this film's depiction of her as the streetwalker and kind of the way that it moralizes it, because I think that scene that you're talking about where it's like, why did we have to assume that she's on drugs? You can be a streetwalker and not be on drugs, right? That can exist simultaneously. But I'm wondering if the movie casts her as someone, if it's trying to lend nuance to her, or if it's to, the rest of the streetwalkers in the film. Like, they all could potentially have, encountered this situation and been just fine and just haven't been treated the same way and were judged, too much for their profession and not for, or is it something about Vivian in particular? And I think that will also shed a lot of light on, where the movie's coming out on this conversation, because, it's possible it is actually a lot more nuanced than maybe some people are giving it credit for.
Well, I mean, I guess I just feel like the movie mostly uses prostitution as a metaphor, and I don't think it actually cares about any real details. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't know that we need to go to, like, romantic comedies, big glossy romantic comedies, for a realistic depiction of anything. Right. I think the movie is very, very consciously shaped as a fairy tale, and it doesn't hide that.
Right.
Absolutely. Through the ending, which I'm excited to get into once we get up to that.
But I think what it is realistic about is certain things between men and women, and it uses prostitution as sort of this metaphor to get to certain things about transactional relationships between men and women.
I feel like a lot of, like, power dynamics for sure play into it a lot, and certainly the way that, like, men will come to the aid of women's, like, they need men to kind of help them succeed, to learn about things and how to kind of level up in society and things like that. What's that called? Am I getting it wrong? The Pygmalion myth? Is that right? Where, like, the artist sort of, like, sculpts his work of art.
Yeah. And playing into that, though, I mean, I think that one of the things about the, like, tellings of that sort of story, like My Fair Lady, is that it really only works if the changes to the woman are cosmetic primarily, while the man has, like, actual inner transformation. And I think that that's one of the things that Pretty Woman does really well.
Yeah.
You know, she doesn't have to change who she is as a person. The movie is confident from the beginning that she's a good person.
Right.
She has to change her clothes.
Mm-hmm.
And the movie, it understands that that is a superficial change. He has to change who he is as a person.
Right. Right. Interesting. I like that. Yeah. I mean, sort of what makes her unique and is her like way that she views the world and the way that she's able to take a lot of. I just love that like that dinner scene, which is like such a stuffy scene, and she's like flicking escargot, and everyone's just like loving it and having a good time, and you know, grandson David is not having it at all. But I think her, you know, her charm kind of comes through there and really kind of wins the meeting. Unfortunately, Edward kind of blows it. But I had another question for you. I wanted to ask, you know, growing up, what was Jewish film like for you? What did that mean to you?
Nothing.
Nothing. Okay.
I didn't think about movies as being Jewish or not Jewish, I think.
Gotcha. Did you ever watch films like, you know, the classic like 10 Commandments or Fiddler on the Roof or any Woody Allen kind of films or?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've seen lots of Woody Allen movies, and I was aware of Fiddler on the Roof as a kid. It was like there's a certain number of musicals that were always on the Disney Channel, and that was one of them. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, for me, like I grew up, you know, my mother's side of the family is Jewish, and so that was a part of my life. But like I would with my grandfather and my mother's father, like I'd watch like The Wizard of Oz. You know, we wouldn't necessarily like be watching movies about Jews.
Gotcha. Yeah. Harry, you want to hit us with that IMDb summary?
Yeah, sure. So just a quick one this week. A man in a legal but hurtful business needs an escort for some social events and hires a beautiful prostitute he meets, only to fall in love.
That's such a weird description. Do they have like AI write those descriptions?
It's always a mixed bag on the IMDb summaries because it's user entered, and I laughed at that when I first read this because, you know, legal but hurtful business, which yeah, sure, like that's
what we're focusing on.
That's what was affected. Yeah, the person who was writing that.
I mean, I guess like corporate raiders, that was kind of like a thing and still is a thing, but you know.
We talk about his growth in the movie, right? He's the one who really changes, and that change, you know, spurred on by her, but you know, ultimately is realized in that big business scene we'll talk about at the end when he, you know, makes the decision this one time not to break up a company and sell it for pieces like he's always done, and that's kind of his big victory by the end of it. So yeah, it's a big part of his trajectory for sure.
I'm curious if, given the right amount of time, if this film will be remade with like 2020 whatever lenses. You know, if like maybe Richard Gere's character is like a tech bro or whatever the equivalent of like a corporate raider is for today's audience.
Something like a consultant.
Oh, yeah. Is that what it is these days? I don't know. I'm not in that world. Let's take a quick break. We'll come back and we'll kind of dive into the plot and we'll talk about some of our favorite scenes. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Jews on Film. We are here with Karina Longworth to discuss the film Pretty Woman. Harry, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, sure. So I was thinking we could just start talking about the beginning of the movie a little bit, you know, loosely, just to set the scene a little bit. You know, we meet Richard Gere's character. We meet Edward. He's at this Hollywood party, and we're introduced to. We learn about his business, right? His amoral business that we heard about in the IMDb summary. He buys these companies, breaks them up, and sells them for pieces. We learn about his lawyer, Phil Stucky, that we mentioned before, who's going to be significant to our discussion, but played by Jason Alexander. But, you know, really wanted to get us started at the, you know, the pivotal scene when we've started to meet Vivian. You know, we see they kind of set the stage. She needs some money. They need to pay rent. Her roommate, like you mentioned, Daniel, has spent some of the money purchasing drugs. So you know, they're soliciting clients, and that's when we find, you know, Edward, as he's leaving the party, she kind of flags down his car, and you know, all he really needed at the time were just directions back to, you know, he's from New York, so he's not very familiar with the Hollywood Hills. So all he needed were some directions. But eventually we have this big meet cute moment, and they, you know, Vivian gets in the car, and, you know, eventually is invited up to his hotel room, you know, for sex worker services, so to speak. But I wanted to jump in and just talk a little bit about them kind of meeting together and our takes on those opening scenes. But, you know, before I jumped into some of the things I had planned, I wanted to hear if anyone else had thoughts just about that whole opening moment of the film.
I think right away what was interesting to me, like when we first meet Vivian, is that like their introduction, she doesn't immediately shift into like sex worker mode in terms of offering up her services. She offers to like give him directions. And I think that sort of introduction kind of sets up that she's different than what we would perceive, you know, and I think that really endears us to her as a character. You know, Jason Alexander's character as Phil, I think his perpetual state is just worry and sort of constant buzzing around with the cell phone and worrying about Edward and the deal that's looming throughout the film. And yeah, but I think it's kind of it sets up their worlds pretty nicely and gives enough context to kind of get people on board with the story.
They set up this interesting balance, I found, of, you know, separating work from romance. And this is a movie where, you know, we have this character who eventually, we know it's a romantic comedy. We know it's going to kind of build towards that. But, you know, there's a couple of ground rules, I think, before she approaches the car, you know, what she has to keep in mind just about, you know, this is business, you're just meeting them. And we'll get the direct quotes in here so that we have the whole thing. And obviously we get that infamous, you know, no kissing rule, because that's something that's very intimate. And, you know, I mentioned this to you before we started recording, Daniel, but I think it's really interesting that this movie, you know, one of the tropes of rom-coms, you know, probably before this movie, but especially since, has been, you know, at least one of the characters, if not both of them, are, you know, very focused on their work lives and don't have time for romance. And that is something that we definitely get with Edward's character. I mean, the movie literally opens with him having a phone call with I think it's his girlfriend at the time, and breaking up with her over the fact that he doesn't spend any time with her and is, you know, too kind of hyper focused on his work. But even with her, we get this weird situation that I wanted to kind of start discussing, where technically the romance is, you would imagine, part of her work, right? Her line of work and what she's supposed to do. Like, her love life could be so intertwined, and the movie goes to, you know, big pains to say, separate it. Like, this is a job. Like, when we meet these two characters, they're on the same footing as, like, this is work only. And it's really interesting the way that I think both of their identities are related and not related from their romantic lives. And I think a big part of his growth in his romantic life later on, Edward, plays into his work life. So that relationship between, I think, work life and romantic life is something this movie is investigating in a way that not all rom-coms do.
I just think that he is announced as a character who treats everything in his life as a transaction. That breakup, and then he runs into this other ex-girlfriend at that party, and he says something to her, like, you know, inspired by the phone conversation he had breaking up with the other woman, where he's like, did you talk to my secretary more than you talked to me? And she says, like, she was the bridesmaid at my wedding. Like, yes, I had to like negotiate my relationship with you through your work. And so it makes perfect sense. Like, it's not even like a fairy tale thing. It's a real world thing that a guy like that, who's only comfortable having transactional relationships, would feel more comfortable having a transparently transactional relationship with a sex worker. I really disagree with the take that, like, a sex worker's love life would overlap with their work. I think that it makes more sense that the default would be the opposite.
Like a separation between your actual, your personal
like,
love
necessary.
life and your, for sure.
That boundaries would have to be set up.
Right. Yeah, and they explicitly are. You know, I was mentioning this, but that's literally something, you know, the movie gives time to, which is to say, here's how you have to separate this from your life, and that kind of distance in there. And I wonder, you know, what kind of causes eventually those walls to crumble in the context of this movie. I mean, you know, it stops becoming about her work once he hires her as a kind of, because eventually he doesn't just hire her as, you know, this one night sex worker, but he says, you're going to stay with me this entire week because I need someone to show up with me to meetings to kind of be charming. And once the relationship, the transactional relationship, like we're calling it, you know, evolves into that, I think the prospect of romance no longer is, you know, the antithesis of what she's doing. I think it just exists somewhat independently, because even so, he's still just saying, you know, I want you to be charming and almost like, you know, a figurehead. Like, I just want you to show up in my meetings and just be there. But I don't think it's as kind of polar and opposed once that relationship changes.
You know, there is something called the girlfriend experience, which is the idea that you will basically play act a relationship. But what you're being paid for is to leave when the person paying wants you to leave. And so I think that's what we're seeing depicted. And yeah, I mean, they end up, you know, having a bond and liking each other, but it's not him saying, I'm going to pay you $3,000 for a week that is the thing that creates that bond. it's them being two human beings in a room together.
It's almost completely like in spite of the relationships that they've created.
Yeah. And I think that this arrangement sort of comes about after Philip sort of insists that Edward get some sort of like company for him for these meetings so that he seems more like fleshed out as a human being and not this like businessman who's just by himself. And I think Philip offers to set him up with someone from his circle, but then, you know, he says, I'm good. I got a girlfriend, or I got someone. So not to worry about it. So
what Edward wants is to just be able to conduct the deal.
Right.
And like if a woman is necessary to that, he doesn't want to have a woman around who he has to have a real relationship with.
Right. Yeah.
And so he thinks that Vivian is the right choice for that.
It creates like favorable conditions for this.
Yeah.
So, you know, throughout the film, there's this deal that's going on where he's helping conduct a deal where I think he's buying some land in Long Beach, and he's trying to, you know, usually what he does is he buys a company and then sell it for pieces for more than what he paid for it initially. So I think that is sort of the frame, this sort of loose business venture that is, you know, being conducted throughout the film, and Vivian's presence helps that hopefully succeed.
There's one thing I want to add, which is a big part of the episode that I've done on this film, which is that, and this is something that I don't think I noticed, you know, the first like 12 times I watched this movie, but like was really apparent to me watching it kind of in middle age, which is that they say in dialogue that Richard Gere's dad died 2 weeks ago. And he has this really complicated relationship with his dad who left him and his mom. And he has kind of worked his whole life to have the professional success so that he could say, like, this pain that my dad caused doesn't matter. And over the course, you know, so, I mean, I'm somebody who I've lost both of my parents. Like I understand grief.
Yeah.
And being able to see this movie as a dead dad movie made it feel a lot richer to me and made me sort of understand a reading of the movie through the Edward character as somebody who we're meeting at like this very raw time. You know, it's sort of the perfect time for him to change his life.
Right. Interesting.
And the, you know, Vivian absolutely plays a role in him, like kind of finding sort of a new thing to live for and like a new thing to orient his emotional life around. But the business deal is also really important because he comes to understand that he's having transactions not with like businesses, but with human beings. And he comes to have like a father figure in Ralph Bellamy. So I think that that's one of the sort of emotional nuances of this film that doesn't get talked about a lot.
I love that read. Yeah, I think I was saying to Harry before that like we could talk about it throughout the episode, but like, you know, as far as like sexual explicitness to this film, I found like the most intimate scenes to be like these pillow talk conversations or the bathtub scenes where they're like, you know, snuggling with each other and like talking about their backgrounds and really like bearing their souls to each other, which to me is like, you know, that's very, you know, sex is a physical act, but like when you are bearing your soul to someone and like talking about your family or yourself, you know, in a very deep way and being vulnerable, I think is like much more close. And, you know, what did he say? He says,
I was very angry with him. It cost me $10,000 in therapy to say that sentence. I was very angry with him. I do it very well, don't I? I'll say it again. I was very angry with him. Hello, my name is Mr. Lewis. I'm very angry with my father.
I would have been angry at the $10,000.
You know, I think that scene was like, you know, that's a very tender scene. It's a very private and intimate scene. And I think that to me, because throughout the other parts of the film, whenever there's like implied sex or sex acts or things like that, it's usually like a fade out and a fade up. And we kind of understand what is going on.
Yeah. I mean, and then also counterpoint, like, I don't think anybody like would have expected Gary Marshall to direct the piano scene.
Right.
Like that's definitely like the sexiest thing in his oeuvre.
Yeah. Totally. I read that Richard Gere actually played the piano, which was pretty neat.
He's a piano player. Yeah.
That's
talented
awesome.
Guy.
Yeah. Unbelievable. But Edward, where does he have time to like get piano lessons when he's like closing so many deals? It's impressive, you know?
I assume it's something he learned as a kid.
Oh, right. So are we thinking that like Edward came from money or that he didn't? And in spite of that, he's like a hustler and like a workaholic kind of thing. I don't know.
I mean, I think it's in the movie him saying that like his dad basically like was this big corporate
Oh,
guy
right,
who
right,
left him and his mom with nothing.
right. Oh,
So
he does say that his first car was a limo. So let me bounce forward a little bit in the plot. So I think at this point I think the deal has been conducted, and Vivian's going to be staying with Edward for the week for the sum of $3,000. There's a nice little negotiation scene where she said, I would do it for 2, and he said, I would have given you 4 or something like that. It's always fun. Yeah, they also, the humor is like, what was that gag? I'm butchering these lines here, but the whole thing where like he calls her twice and he says like,
Hello.
Never, ever pick up the phone.
Then why are you calling me?
Did you buy clothes today?
Hello?
I told you not to pick up the phone.
Then stop calling me.
pretty good writing here. Like they definitely are able to like play with tone and mix it all up nicely.
I mean, it's just like a self-conscious homage to the screwball comedies of the 30s and 40s, I think.
That's a good call out for sure. Coming up like after that, after the deal has been signed and we're ready to go, Edward, he tells Vivian that she needs to go out and get something nice to change her wardrobe because she's still kind of in her sex worker uniform, and he wants to make sure that she looks nice for their dinner. So she goes out to Rodeo Drive and pops into a store and is almost immediately turned away by the shopkeepers because she has her money, but they're not wanting to help her out just because of the way she's dressed. So then Barnard, the hotel manager, played by Hector Elizondo, calls in a favor and helps her out so that she can get some nice clothing, and also shows her the ropes about like dining. You have the shrimp fork and the salad fork and this fork and that fork and all that kind of stuff. And so then Edward, brings her along to the business dinner with Mr. James Burns and his grandson David, and they chat a little bit, and she charms the group with her kind of like unconventional ways, and tries to not take herself too seriously, and she succeeds in charming them. But like I said before, Edward's proposition kind of pisses them off, so it's not really a success in that regard. Edward, hears about Vivian having a hard time shopping, so the next day he takes her out on a shopping spree, and she gets a lot more clothing, and she has enough clothes for this upcoming polo match that Edward's company has sponsored. At this polo game, Edward speaks to Philip, and he eventually reveals that Vivian's, he reveals her true identity as a sex worker. And Philip takes this as an invitation to sort of be cruel to Vivian and make sort of a few unwelcome sexual advances towards her outside. Upon returning from the game, Vivian is really upset with Edward for telling Philip that she's a sex worker, and she threatens to leave. Edward is able to talk her into staying, and they continuing to accompany him for the week.
I think the shopping scene is it's one of the most memorable scenes of the movie, sure. And it's pretty significant for that main thesis just about like you were saying, I think, Karina, that who she always was, that she was always this person, but her dress just dictated it, and her where she was coming from just dictated the way that everyone else around her treated it. And we get that really amazing comparison where first she walks into the store and she's very rudely dismissed, they without questioning, and it's not even about the money at that point. I mean, that it's interesting actually, because to them it's almost like you would think that working in this fashion store on Rodeo Drive, it would be purely transactional in the sense that if you have the money to pay for any of these dresses, please. But there is this kind of like guiding ethic that they see the way she's dressed, they see who she is, that they refuse to even take her money. They say like,
how much is this, Marie?
It's very expensive.
It's very expensive.
Look, I got money to spend in here.
I don't think we have anything for you. You're obviously in the wrong place. Please leave.
There's the comparison, of course, to when she comes back, obviously having, shopped herself and looking a different way, and all of a sudden she's treated differently. But, even the comparison to Barnard, you said, who is working at the hotel and, immediately recognizes, everything that's going on here, knows the situation, and is just so willing to, coach her through, very unsolicited, like, you're going to this dinner, let me like give you, more than you need. It's not just about, let me basically, it's almost like show you how to present yourself in this world. But even that ultimately is not, end goal, because even that is it's just posturing, right? It's just looking a certain way. And even, you know, when she is herself and when she is charming, I think that ultimately proves more effective in terms of the relationship. You know, we learned that the son of the business, of the grandson, who actually means to, like, he wants to follow up with her later. Like, that to me felt like it was, you know, far more effective than any of the kind of coding and dress that she could put on herself. So it's interesting the way that the movie navigates this and all those couple of scenes.
You know, this is Jews on Film, so at some point I kind of wanted to talk about this idea of, like, you know, conservative dress versus like provocative dress or whatever. Like, there's this concept in Jewish, you know, like tzniut or like modesty, and so like this idea that, like, you know, you have to wear a skirt a certain length or sleeves up to a certain point. That to me, like, looking at it through that lens, certainly played heavily, you know, in my viewing in terms of this film, because it's an often talked about concept in with regards to, like, what women wear in more religiously observant Jewish circles. Like, modesty is like a very big focus, whether it's like covering your hair or making sure that your clothing is certain lengths. And so seeing, you know, the way that she dressed, her change from sort of more revealing clothing to like more conservative clothing. I think even Edward asked her to buy something elegant and conservative. Like, he gives her that sort of instruction. And so I certainly viewed it through that lens.
Where do you think the movie comes out on that, right? Like, where do you think, is this a movie that just kind of follows that approach of, you know, the more kind of modestly and maybe elegantly dressed, that's something that, you know, she's rewarded for ultimately? Or do you think, because I think, per, you know, the way I was talking about those past scenes, like, I think the movie embraces that. It has its fun with the, you know, the shopping scene, and it has those iconic, you know, she's holding all the bags and she walks in. But I think to a certain extent the movie is able to look past that and say that, you know, she is so charming and moving, like, because of who she is, and that never had anything to do with the dress. And I'm not sure if the movie, because there are moments towards the end where, again, you know, she meets her friend again and she comments on the way that she's dressed. And, you know, I don't know where that plays into her ultimate growth, if that was, you know, something positive, negative, or just helped her kind of understand her place in the world and maybe got her in the door. But once she was there, she was able to be herself. But I don't know. How do you think the movie falls out on that question?
I think the movie understands that the women in the store are wrong. I just think that the movie is saying, like, this is a shallow system. This is a system that only values superficiality, and that she gets rewarded for participating in it, but that doesn't mean that the system is right.
Yeah, for sure. You know, I've been thinking throughout our discussion about that original ending we spoke about, and both in this context and what that would have said if, you know, she kind of goes back to her life and how, you know, she's changed, what she learns from that if she rejects that, but also, you know, in the context of the transactions we're talking about, and what if this was just this kind of week-long transaction, and how moved are they from this? You know, it raises the question, and obviously this is jumping ahead to the end, but, you know, where are these characters 5 days later, 2 weeks later, 6 months later? Like, what kind of life are they settling into? Vivian has only known, you know, since she kind of decided to become, or since she moved into this life, we don't know what she'll be doing afterwards, because she's never, you know, we've never seen her in that context. And even Edward, like, is he going to take this new approach he's found to all of his work after this? Was this just like in this one project he really got to know this older man, and he wanted to honor his legacy? And I'm not sure, you know, we've discovered a broken system. That kind of feels like what's happened over the course of this week. And the question is, where do we go from there? Is the answer fairy tale love, or maybe this is the fairy tale where it doesn't matter where we go from here? You know, it's supposed to wrap up there.
Well, I think that if this movie was made, you know, later, there definitely would have been a sequel or like a TV show version of it. And I mean, I think I say in my episode about it that, like, we really have no idea if he, like, is going to be able to have an actual relationship. Right. Because we've only seen evidence that he can have transactions. So, you know, I like, the jury's out on that one. But I mean, just thinking about you guys talking about the Hector Elizondo scenes, you know, I think that he's not doing that out of the goodness of his heart. He's doing it so that she will fit in the establishment of the hotel. And he's also kind of grooming her to be a higher class hooker. There's benefit for both of them if she is able to be of service to the type of clientele that stays at his hotel.
Right.
So like I could imagine a Pretty Woman TV show where there's no Richard Gere character. There's just like the Julia Roberts character and the Hector Elizondo character. And there's this hotel and she's having different relationships with different men.
Love it. Like John of the Week.
Going on like
that.
different business meetings. Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's time to kind of get on the stretch train, if that's okay. Because I had a big stretch here. So there's this concept in some Jewish circles of like a shadchan, which is like a matchmaker. I mean, there's matchmakers in any culture, obviously. But like, I think he plays this like, to me, you know, one read could be that he's like matchmaking up until the end where he was like, oh, by the way.
You know, Daryl also drove Miss Vivian home yesterday.
So he's kind of like egging it along a little bit. You know, the fact that he's like calling in favors for her and like showing her how to eat. I feel like he really wants things to happen between them. And so he's kind of like making sure that happens. I'm sure what you were saying, Karina, like that he does say at the end, I hope to see you back at the hotel. So there's definitely the reality that he's like, yeah, maybe you'll, you know, bring more business back to the hotel or something like that. But I think if we're on the stretch train, I thought that was something that like stuck out to me, because I think the whole relationship, again, very stretchy and definitely subtext and not literal at all. But I think it builds up to this sort of like the culmination, I think, is that sort of sex scene kind of at the end of, you know, sort of closer to the end of the movie where they like, you know, they consummate their love with each other on screen and they kiss and things like that. But up until then, we're still kind of like building to it. And I think that's probably narrative structure. But I had this sort of read of just like getting ready, not like a wedding, but like almost like a wedding in a sense that it's like it's very chaste, right? So we're not seeing a lot of stuff at the beginning, and it's a lot of implied this and that. They're eating strawberries, they're watching TV together, and it's kind of like they're going on dates. And then eventually, you know, things get a little bit more serious towards the end. But I don't know. Maybe I'm too far on the stretch train, Harry. What do you think? Reel me back in.
No, I think, you know, even by then, and they've consummated. And I think there's something powerful about this is a movie where we haven't seen it all, but there's been, you know, an implied amount of sex until this point, but the real consummation is just kind of them kissing, because that obviously, you know, takes this from, like we said, from one aspect of a transaction to, you know, something more akin to romantic love. But, you know, for me, the kisses is one really meaningful scene. I think in the context of this conversation, especially about the transactional nature of their relationship, it's when, you know, and ultimately they have this falling out because, you know, she becomes, and just, you know, to sort of catch up, she's, you know, embarrassed of the way that he's treating her, because she realizes that he's still treating her like, you know, like a sex worker, and, you know, the way that he's talking to his lawyer about her, and that kind of gets back to her. And then, you know, there's all these things that happen. But the biggest scene for me is when she, you know, is leaving, and he, you know, pulls out of his wallet, he takes out the, you know, negotiated, I think $3,000, puts it on the table. And what's so striking to him is seeing that she doesn't take it, you know, and then it kind of clicks in his head, like,
okay,
you know, right, like her not taking the money. And you can imagine this is a person who's wealthy, and, you know, I don't need to say the word transaction a 20th time, but, you know, just seeing the way that she doesn't take it, and that this wasn't actually about this. I mean, that's the hardwiring of his brain. You know, that's where it's changing. I think even by the time, you know, they're kissing, for him at least, I'm sure he's kissed, you know, many women, and I'm sure that he's, you know, I mean, with all his past wives, girlfriends, like that was always a part of the relationship. I don't think where that might have been probably the most meaningful moment for her, because like we said, we outlined her rules in the beginning that, you know, when you're dealing with a customer, there's no kissing. For him, it was, you know, when you're dealing with someone, there has to be payment at the end, or there has to be some sort of mutual benefit. And each of them kind of independently have their own moments of realization, which, you know, definitely reflects the different paths that I think both of them are on. But it's interesting what that looks like for both of them. It almost feels like they each had different goals from everything.
That's interesting. I don't know. For me, there's a really important scene, and sort of like whether or not they're actually having a romance is the breakfast scene where he's like,
I've arranged for you to have an apartment, have a car, have a wide variety of stores guaranteed to suck up to you anytime you want to go shopping. Everything's done.
What else? You can leave some money by the bed when you pass through town?
Vivian, it really wouldn't be like that.
How would it be?
Well, for one thing, it would get you off the streets.
and she's like, well, that's just geography. Like, I would still be your whore, but you'd just sort of pretend I was your girlfriend, and we'd just be continuing this transaction. And that's not what I want. You know, it's basically like they come to an impasse. He says he can't offer her anything
Right.
else at that point, and I don't know. It's very interesting to me that that they even include that scene, because it's like she's basically this is like after, I'm sure we're going to talk about the Jason Alexander scene. She's basically challenged him to say, like, are you going to treat me like a human being who is equal to you? And can we have a relationship that is not just about your needs, but is about both of our needs? And he says, I can't do that. And, the movie could end there, but because it's a fairy tale, it does not.
And if I remember correctly, I think that almost not immediately, but kind of comes right before that scene where she walks out without the money. And I think even in real time, I don't think he thinks that, like, I think when he offers her, the apartment, he's very excited about it. I think he believes that he's giving her what she wants. And I think he's, taking what he considers this relationship to be to what he feels like is the natural next level. That's where he's always taken it. And I think it's her response coupled with, her reaction, not even taking the money when all is kind of lost, is just this, oh, maybe I'm dealing with something else here. Maybe this isn't what I thought.
Like, one thing that stuck out to me about that, like, particular offer, Karina, was that, like, I don't know if he explicitly spelled it out, but he was saying something about, like, getting her off the streets. Like, that was
Right.
like to rescue her. Like, I'm going to rescue you, and I'm going to put you
Right.
up in this LA condo, and then you're no longer going to be what you are, and you're going to be like, I'm going to keep you in my castle, kind of thing. And
that's when
you.
she says, that's just geography.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that idea is something that, I've heard in, modern parlance, is like this concept of saving, and I've heard it in, like, specifically actually in like a song contest with, like, rappers will talk about, like, saving people, which is like taking people from, lesser means and just kind of, joining with them and, like, helping pull them out of their social class into, this wealthier one. And I think, like, again, that plays into where he's coming from this, that he still thinks he's kind of extending to her and doing the favor, almost like he would be okay, without her. But this is an incredible gesture towards her. And I think for this to be a relationship that, is actually, mutual and successful, there has to be this coming from the same place and meeting in the middle. And that kind of power imbalance that he thinks of when he says, let me pull you here, like, that's how he's always felt like, I can do good for the women in my life. I can take care of them. And, this goes beyond the actual text of the film, because we don't see how he interacts with everyone outside of her. But it's almost like he believes that he needs to, be using his means, his own gains to help, these women in his life. But she's kind of correcting and like, no, that's not what we need from each other. You need to be there, on my terms, what I want. And ultimately what she asks for is that kind of fairy tale sequence that we get at the very end, which is that big romantic gesture, which at that point in the film, I would say is inconceivable to him.
Ultimately, towards the end of the film, we do see that, like, in my mind, I feel like she holds the greater power in that she has the ability to, like, enact actual change. Like, Karina, you said earlier, her change is mostly cosmetic, new dress, new necklace, whatever, that kind of thing. But, like, she is able to get through this guy who's, like, a notoriously tough guy businessman. And she's able to enact change both in his personal life and in his business life, something that Philip is not able to do.
Broadly, we kind of get to, there's sort of these big moments towards the end of the movie. I mean, the opera scene is part of this continued, as they're getting closer, they go to the opera together. And, it's actually an interesting line that I'd want to unpack where Ed says to Vivian,
People's reactions to opera the first time they see it is very dramatic. They either love it or they hate it. If they love it, they will always love it. If they don't, they may learn to appreciate it, but it will never become part of their soul.
And it's interesting that, his whole perception of people just innately being drawn to it or not. But so they have that big opera scene. But, the real momentous scene that I think we should definitely talk about is with Philip, where, Philip, we mentioned this in an earlier scene, had found out that Edward had been dealing with, a sex worker, and he gets, very excited by this idea of Philip, and later shows up at her. He actually goes to the hotel room because the big deal had fallen through, right? Edward had kind of grown a heart and decided he wasn't going to dismantle this company, signed the contract without Philip in the room. And Philip is very upset because he's lost a lot of money over this. So he goes to the hotel room to confront Edward, but only Vivian is there. And that's when we have that very upsetting scene where he, quite literally sexually assaults Vivian until, Edward kind of shows up in the room and breaks it up. But, he storms out very angrily, you cost my chance, you ruined my money. And he blames her for, evoking the change in Edward. But Daniel, what did you want to where do you want to start us off on that scene, because that's pretty significant, I think.
Let me jump back to the opera, because I thought, it's worth calling out. It's kind of like an iconic scene where she comes out. She's wearing this like very fancy red dress with this ruby red necklace worth, I think they could say $250,000, and she's moved by this opera. She's seeing the opera is called La Traviata, which is, I think it's sort of closely mirrors the story we're watching, right? It's about a sex worker meeting a rich person, if I'm not mistaken, and she's very moved by it, and so they're doing that. And I think it's almost like a spiritual experience. I wrote down in my notes, it's kind of like again, back on the stretch train, but I feel like she's super moved by this, where you would expect maybe that he would be the cultured person who's like totally moved by it. And I think, the house lights go back up. She's got tears in her eyes, and he's totally like less affected by it, I think. But it's a very binary, like you said, Harry, I think it's a binary reaction, right? It's either you love it or you hate it. It's like, well, there is nuance here. I thought that was kind of an interesting scene.
It's a pretty facile way of doing it, but I mean, I think that it's just trying to suggest that, like, if you had this idea that she was like a completely uneducated, like lower class of person because of what she does for a living, like, here's an example of how she could fit into his world.
She plays the part, like dress wise, and
I don't think she's playing a part. I don't think she's pretending to like the opera.
Oh, no.
And I don't know, I just feel like human beings can surprise you. Like I actually had like a very similar situation recently where I told somebody that I was going to go to an opera, and it was somebody who I guess I had perceived as not being that cultured. And that person said, "Oh, I went to see Tosca recently. It was great." And so, I just think this sort of reflects like something that is very common of having assumptions about somebody based on what they do for a living, or their race or their religion or whatever it is.
Sure.
And people being able to surprise you.
Right. Yeah. We contain multitudes, right? We could talk about that sort of penultimate scene with Philip. Like you said, Harry, Vivian kind of inspires Edward to kind of think differently about life, and he ends up making a personal appeal. He does very much have this sort of like father-son relationship with Mr. Burns, and he puts his hand on his shoulder, and you could see that Edward is very affected by this, and they end up, having an agreeable conclusion to this deal. But, when Philip does come by and is mostly concerned about the deal going sideways, as our coded Jewish character, I kind of wanted to talk about that and sort of see if that was the takeaway for most people.
Well, I think it's like, obviously it's bad, like to have like the one Jewish character in the movie be the most sort of greedy and violent. I mean, I just want to clarify that the deal doesn't go away, it changes.
Yeah.
And that's what Philip is upset about, because what they were going to do was sell this guy's company and make a ton of money immediately. And instead, Edward is going to go into business with the Ralph Bellamy character, and they're going to work together to build ships and get government contracts. And so it's still a deal. They're still going to make money. They're just going to make it's going to take time to make the money. It's not going to be like one huge cash in immediately. Yeah. And so that's what Philip is upset about, is that, and I mean, also, I think he feels like he's being replaced in Edward's life as well. The movie thinks that both things are equally important, both his greed and his sort of like feeling like he's kicked to the curb.
Right.
Yeah. And obviously after, that sequence plays out, it's pretty clear he's fired, from that point on, and is kind of out of her life. And I think Philip's coming from a place, like you're saying, of he's been replaced already. Like the ethic has changed, the rules have changed. Like this guy's willing to make relationships with other people. You can imagine until this point, it was really, Philip felt like that was all to himself. And I think that's the cause of a lot of his anxiety. But I do also, I want to talk about, the Jewishness of him, because, I had a funny conversation with someone when this movie was suggested, and when I was telling a friend we're recording an episode soon on Pretty Woman, they kind of gave me a little bit of a puzzled look just on, like we mentioned at the top, just the question of the Jewishness, but they said, oh, that guy from Seinfeld's in it, so I guess that's like Jewish. And it's interesting. Okay. And I think it's his presence on Seinfeld. It's who Jason Alexander is. It's, the New York, Jew like archetype that we've spoken about a lot. I do think that there's some explicit coding, that doesn't take place in this movie. I think in the context of the movie, at least explicitly, his role is more of the, he's supposed to be the ruthless, the ruthless business person, the guy that's, really marks the changes that Edward's gone through, because then you see in opposition to who he could have been, had he kind of pushed towards the, further grotesque. But it's not hard, I think, to pull, especially through the lens that we were watching this movie, just some of the, the nastier tropes about this, greedy lawyer character. And I think if his anxiety was exclusively about being, replaced and cast aside, and, the whole thing had imploded, I think it would be a little bit more sympathetic. But especially when it comes down to not just greed over a deal not going through, but greed over a deal just taking more time and maybe not being quite as profitable as it could have been, I think that, especially through this lens, starts to cast that moment as a little bit more of an upsetting scene to watch, from a Jewish lens, I would say.
Yeah. And I mean, it's like, it's so venal the way that if he feels like he's being replaced by Vivian, then he takes it out on Vivian, and he takes it out in this violent sexual way. And also, like, compared to Richard Gere, Jason Alexander is not conventionally attractive, and he's sort of short and not slim, and like, I think these are all sort of bad stereotypes of, like, sort of the Jewish troll.
Right.
Yeah, it sucks. It's not good.
Not a good look for the Jews. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, no, we sometimes ask that. Is this good for the Jews, bad for the Jews? This one might not, as a moment, might not be great. No. But what's interesting is, after watching, like we're saying, just to bring it back to the buzzword of the episode, but as we've seen the kind of transactional nature of a lot of these relationships kind of veer off, and we're getting to a place by this point where, Edward has come to understand that relationships aren't necessarily, I mean, this is the most, I think, explicit, like, not only is he taking his own, Jason Alexander, right, Philip's character, is he taking her, his own sexual pleasure, or dominant, because it's not necessarily about that, but this kind of, dominant from her, but he's doing it to get back at someone else. Like, it is like he is objectifying her in the sense that, like, in the most explicit sense we've seen anyone in this movie in terms of, sexuality, because he is like, I am taking this to prove a point at someone else, and maybe to command my own, very selfish sense of power, over you. But this is like, again, it stands in just this incredible contrast to, where we've seen the rest of our characters go, and it epitomizes probably the worst of, how sex can be transactional, and, not even a transaction. I mean, fully one-sided, really.
Well, I mean, he says something awful to her, like,
maybe you're a very good hooker, I mean, maybe if I do you, then I wouldn't care about losing millions of dollars.
The way he talks about it, it's like he expects her to pay him in free sex for the money that he's lost.
I mean, I think he's the only person in the film who kind of judges her for her, like, her job in life. I
think Edward absolutely judges her. I mean, that's what the drug floss thing is about.
Right.
Like,
that's true.
There's so many ways in which he dehumanizes her through dialogue, and just through his whole attitude of, like, no one can know you're a hooker.
Right.
So I think that that's part of, like, why the story of the movie is like an enormous journey from him thinking of her as less than a human being, to being like, I'm actually going to reorient my life around you.
Yeah. I guess Edward does it with a little bit more tact and panache than Philip, who kind of is just like, yeah, I'm going to sexually assault you or whatever. Like, yeah, it's a very gross look for the Jews.
So before we go to break and go to the end of the movie, I wanted to mention the biblical comp, the biblical allusion that I kind of was able to place in this movie, and definitely wanted to hear some of your thoughts here, because immediately trying to scope out the Jewishness, a lot of times Daniel and I will look towards, what biblical story, where can we see that this is, mirrored, sourced. And, the first one that came to mind for me was, it's in the first book of the Torah, the book of Genesis, Bereshit, is we have the story of Yehuda and Tamar. I'll play out kind of like how this is comparative, but especially given, our conversation, I think it really holds up. But very, very briefly, because the story is a lot more complex than this, but, Tamar is, she's married to Judah, to Yehuda's oldest son. And what happens is his son dies without them producing a child. So, as was Jewish law, or as is Jewish law, if they don't produce a child, then, she is supposed to get married then to the next oldest son in line, and kind of, continuing. So what happens is she gets married to the next one, and then again, he dies very young. So instead of letting her stay as part of the family, Judah kind of views her in a very negative light. And what ends up happening is that she puts on costuming, and we're talking about clothing, and dresses up as a sex worker, and basically has a relation with Yehuda, kind of inconspicuously. He doesn't know who she is the point. And eventually she is pregnant. She's able to conceive from this, but later on, Judah sees her, out of costume and says, what have you done? And, wants to have her killed. But she kind of explains to him, actually, you weren't letting me into your family. So it was me. I'm the person you slept with. And she takes some proof to prove it to her. And he recognizes what happens. He sees her and he says, okay, I was wrong. He admits guilt and welcomes her into the family. The thing that was exciting to me about it is just the way that their relationship changes, Judah's character, and the way that he's the one who has to undergo this kind of reorienting, reframing the way that he thinks about just belonging, family, and relationships, because again, we come from this place, and I'm going to try to use, the comp words, but where he views, her role in this family very transactional. You're producing a child for me, you're going to, or for my, producing a grandchild, and it's all about kind of what she can give. And when she can't give that, he casts her away. The relationship is supposed to be much more nuanced than that, and that he isn't supposed to think of her that way. And that kind of, there's this big moment of recognition that he has. So I saw a lot of comparisons there. I'm not trying to claim that, I'm not trying to claim that, the movie, when they were writing this movie, they were thinking, how can we draw this into that story?
Sure.
But I think there is an early kind of Jewish approach to, the way that sex is used and the way that, relationships are found with people, in unconventional ways.
It's good to have like some historical context, but I feel like it may be a little bit on the stretch train. I'm curious, like, what sort of change did you sort of see Tamar like taught Judah after they got together? You're saying there was like a change that was noted somewhat? Like, was he taking off his shoes and walking in the grass? Was it like that kind of change? You know what I'm saying? Like,
That's exactly what I think is supposed to happen. I think it's not just like, yes, there's a cynical read of that. I think that is, well, she produced the child, so now she was valuable to him, which, that could be a version. It's not how I chose to understand that story. It was more of I was wrong to cast you out. I didn't value you for you kind of thing.
Yeah.
More to the point of the biblical touchstones than to add anything meaningful. But
for sure.
I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah. It's unfortunate that like a lot of the work is on the woman to enact positive change in a man, it seems, or, like the guys can't do like their own sort of self-discovery and I mean, Edward did get therapy, which is good, but like ultimately,
I don't think she forced him to. I think she was fully prepared to walk away. I just think the movie is, she was a very positive force, in his life.
For sure.
Yeah. I mean, she basically has to give up on him in order to spur him to meet her halfway or come to her, rather than the type of relationship, they had and that he proposed that they continue to have, which is like him standing on one end and her moving all the way to him. Like he has to come a little bit towards her.
Sure. This was our sort of discussion of the plot and a little bit of we touched a little bit on the themes, but I feel like maybe we're due for another quick break, and we'll come back and we'll rate the film on a scale of 1 to 5 Jewish stars in terms of like content, themes, and then cast and crew. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Jews on Film. We are discussing Pretty Woman, and now we are up to the point in the show where we will debate its content, cast and crew, themes, and give it a ranking on a scale of 1 to 5 Jewish stars, depending how Jewish it is. Daniel, why don't you get us started?
Absolutely. Sure thing. So I think maybe we'll just start with the cast and crew. In terms of our main cast, I think the only person that we know of that's Jewish is, unfortunately, it's Jason Alexander as Philip Stucky. And then the writer, J.F. Lawton, I don't believe is Jewish. And I did some research during the break. It turns out Gary Marshall is not actually Jewish, but is regularly cast as a Jew, which is interesting. He was baptized Presbyterian and raised Lutheran.
Yeah, I think I can defend you there just a little bit. I found this one article. First I looked it up also, Gary Marshall Jewish, and here's a quote I could pull from there, but it says, the director and actor was so often mistaken for a Jew that it was mentioned in an obituary. So it kind of feels like you've got some company there. Yeah, I think the article says, if there was a competition for the most Jewish seeming non-Jew, the late Gary Marshall would have topped the podium. Like, It feels like that was part of his brand, so to speak, and his identity, even though that wasn't how he was born and raised.
Yeah.
Well, where do you guys come down on that? Do you feel like it's like blackface?
we flirted with talking about Jew face a little bit in that
Yeah.
question.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think I mentioned this in an earlier episode, but it depends where you're taking it, and when it becomes negative caricature and negative stereotype, and that you're kind of accentuating your own, your own face, your own affect to create, a quote unquote Jewish character. I start to see some issues there, but it's acting, and if you want to, honor and play kind of like a Jewishness or a Jewish sensibility, I think there's a lot of merit to that, and I love that the Jewish sensibility has value to people kind of outside of just Jewish actors. So I think I'm a little more okay with it in this context. But how do you feel about it?
I think it's not such a clear-cut issue. I think, certainly like as of late, you see like the Leonard Bernstein biopic with Bradley Cooper, and he's got this sort of prosthetic nose on.
Yeah, that's rough.
Which is like accurate to Leonard Bernstein, but then also the fact that it's like Bradley Cooper and not someone maybe Jewish. The flip side of that is that like, our Mount Rushmore of, non-Jews playing Jews, we have like John Turturro, we have Tony Shalhoub, often cast as a Jew, not a Jew, and they do great performances in those roles. Would I have felt better about someone, in Philip Stucky's role if it wasn't Jason Alexander? Like, let's say if it was John Turturro or Tony Shalhoub or one of those characters. Like, I don't know that it would have. Maybe I would have felt like, yeah, I don't know. This is like
somebody not coded as Jewish at all,
right?
Like
just
John Goodman.
Sure, yeah,
right.
just
because in this case, it's almost like I wish they had moved further away from Jewish, because this is a movie that doesn't name this character Jewish, but I think is playing on some of the audience stereotypes about that look, that aesthetic, and that it's believable that he would go to such extremes over a little bit of money because of some of those stereotypes.
It's interesting because like in 2023, with like a focus on authentic casting in terms of like race or gender expression or sexual orientation or thing like that, it is important for a lot of communities to have their selves represented on screen. It doesn't seem that it often carries over with like Jewish portrayals. It is getting somewhat better, but I think that's still something that's a little bit of like a blind spot. And often the portrayal of like Jewish life on screen is like something to be like not desired, or someone fleeing that like.
No, but I mean, I feel, frustrated when I see like, the Felicity Jones as Ruth Bader Ginsburg types castings.
Sure.
And I say that as somebody who's half Jewish and half British. So technically, like, I'm both represented there. But,
right.
It does just make you feel like, especially when it's like, I can't remember who the actress was, but there was like recently announced that like another British actress was going to play Carole King. Mm-hmm. And it's like, you just like, if you cast somebody who doesn't have sort of like the Semitic looks in somebody who iconically did, then either you're asking for a prosthetic nose, or you're just saying like, we couldn't possibly cast somebody who looked like Carole King because that person wouldn't be beautiful.
Right. Yeah. That's an interesting point. Yeah. Well, Hollywood has a lot of work to do, and I hope, I hope. It's a tough question, I think, and there's like layers to it. I think certainly for me, it's not like every time that there's a Jewish role that has to be played by a Jew. I just think that it does help lend an air of authenticity to it in terms of, especially the looks, but also the rituals depicted on screen and things like that. We did a few horror films that had like, we did The Vigil and we also did The Offering, which are like horror films that take place in the Hasidic world, and they cast a lot of Jewish people in the role, and certainly, sort of leaning on that as a way to lend authenticity to the film and create this world, I think certainly helped. So, but back to our ratings. Given our conversation, the Jude and Tamar of it all, and my very stretchy sort of reads on the matchmakerness and the modesty talk and all that kind of stuff. We have our content, our cast and crew, and our themes. So talking about those things, factoring into those things, where do you feel like the film lands on a scale of 1 to 5 Jewish stars?
I mean, I guess like 1.
Okay.
Really, probably pretty low. I probably shouldn't have suggested it. Sorry.
No, this was this was a super fun conversation and a great film to explore. I think, I often find that the films that are like so obviously Jewish maybe are maybe less exciting to talk about because there's less to like dig and uncover. And so I feel like this is a good one to talk about because it forces us to dig in and find these biblical references and get on the stretch train more than once. So, Harry, where are you falling on this film?
Trying to work out the way to bump up the numbers. I mean, it's funny because I am using that story that I told where I spoke to someone and said, we're talking about this Jewish, Jews on film, and they mentioned the Jason Alexander of it all. And I don't know if anyone would have thought of that. The question is, would someone have gotten that conclusion without framing it like, for the Jews on Film podcast, talking about the Jewishness, and they would have pulled him out there. Because like we said, like in the movie, he's obviously not cast as a Jewish character, or at least it's not explicitly referenced, but his presence in the film, I hope it's not the most memorable part of the film. I hope the way that people endearingly look back to this movie, they're not kind of putting it in consideration with him and his role there, because obviously from a Jewish perspective, that's a little bit challenging. In terms of the the themes of it, the content, I'm going to stick with my little stretch, even though I'm not sure how well you guys received it, but I do think that the way that a lot of stories can be traced back, there's clearly some some questions there, but I'm not sure, not so much explicitly, a lot of good themes of transaction and the relationships that I'm sure if we dove deeper, spent another week on, we could find some Jewish comps to that, maybe some Jewish like laws or values that that deal with stuff like that. But I was actually going to stick also close to, I think, a 1 on this one. How about you, Daniel? Where would you weigh in?
I mean, I think I'll probably come up alongside you two, kind of maybe 1 or so, 1.5. I don't, I think there's all of our stretches, which I don't usually award full points for that one. I think the character maybe 0.5 point, and then the stretch is 0.5 point. Not a hugely Jewish film, but I think, I mean, we could always ask the question, do you think either Vivian or Edward are maybe Jewish or have a Jewish soul or anything like that? I mean, we're back on the stretch train, but like, are there any thoughts about that?
I mean, I don't think we see any evidence of certainly any religious practice
right
on the part of either of them. But in terms of like the more cultural stuff or the stereotypes and tropes, like when, I think that the Jason Alexander character fits with, some of the negative stereotypes, but then you have to also just, I guess, question, like, obviously, like those stereotypes read to like an uneducated audience as Jewish.
Yeah.
But like, are they actually Jewish?
Right.
Like obviously not, generally not, but
right. I would have loved like a deleted scene of like Vivian lighting maybe Shabbat candles, and then like Edward, maybe saying Kaddish for his recently departed father. It would have bumped it up. It would have bumped it up a few stars, but unfortunately, I think this is where we're
did
at,
he sit Shiva? I don't think so.
That's a good question. You said he was
2
weeks out.
He would have gotten up exactly very recently. Probably he would have had a beard possibly for Shloshim if that was his practice.
Yeah.
So
good call.
I would guess he's not Jewish, or just not practicing observant. But
I feel
maybe
like
in the sequel they'll cover that.
Yeah, maybe, or maybe what was that was it the Netflix show where it's like take place in the hotel? Maybe Edward will make a cameo appearance once in a while. I think I'm into that. Yeah. Karina, thank you so much for being here on Jews on Film to discuss Pretty Woman. Really appreciate you picking this film and giving us a chance to explore it again. It's like it came out in 1990, so it's 33 years, which is crazy. It seems crazy that came out so long ago. But could you tell our listeners a little bit about You Must Remember This and Erotic 90s?
Sure. Yeah. I've been doing a podcast called You Must Remember This since 2014. It's about basically 20th century Hollywood and the secret and forgotten stories of the films and stars of 20th century Hollywood. And I do different seasons based on different themes. And last year I did a season called Erotic 80s, which is about sex in Hollywood movies in the 80s. And now I'm doing the sequel, Erotic 90s, which is about sex in Hollywood film in the 90s. And so it premiered March 28th, and there's going to be 21 episodes before the end of the year. So it's going to be there's a Pretty Woman episode. There's going to be episodes on Thelma and Louise and Basic Instinct and Showgirls and lots of stuff.
That sounds awesome. I can't wait to listen. At this point, the season has already started, so make sure to check it out. We'll have a link in the show notes below. Is there anywhere on social media that people can find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Karina Longworth, and then the podcast is at You Must Remember This.
Fantastic. And make sure if you're interested in the podcast to become a Patreon subscriber, because I know Karina is always dropping posts up there as well, right?
Yeah, there's like bonus content at least once a week on Patreon.
Harry, anything to plug?
Keep listening to this podcast.
All right. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, happy birthday to the podcast, right, Harry? I mean, we just turned 1. We'll probably have some birthday cake. Yeah, it's crazy to think, but we really appreciate.
Congratulations!
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful year. It's been a real honor to have you on the podcast. I'm a huge fan of You Must Remember This. So thank you so much for joining us. And make sure for everyone listening to follow us on all the social medias. And if you have any questions or comments, or you want us to check out any movies in the future, you can email us at jewsonfilmpod@gmail.com. Have a good one. Jews on Film is hosted and produced by Harry Ottensasser and Daniel Zana. Daniel edited this episode. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at Jews on Film and subscribe to our podcast to get new episodes. Thanks for listening.